The year was 1847, and hunger had a way of making decent folk do desperate things. When Thomas Hartwell saw Thuman and her 2 young daughters scraping mold off rotten apples behind his barn, he knew their story before a single word was spoken. The prairie wind carried more than dust that autumn. It carried the broken dreams of families who'd lost everything to drought, disease, or worse. What he did next would change for lives forever. None of them knew it as they stood there in the fading light of a merciless Kansas sunset. The rotting apples lay scattered beneath the gnarled branches of Thomas Hartwell's old apple tree, casualties of an early frost that had claimed most of his orchard. He'd been meaning to clear them away, but the work of a single man trying to keep a homestead running left little time for such tasks. Now, as he rounded the corner of his weathered barn with a bucket of feed for his horses, he stopped dead in his tracks. A woman knelt in the dirt, her worn calico dress spread around her like wilted petals. Her hair, once perhaps golden, hung in matted strands around a face that spoke of too many sleepless nights and empty meals. Beside her, 2 little girls, one maybe 8 years old, the other no more than 5, sat cross-legged in the dust. All 3 were carefully peeling away the brown mushy parts of fallen apples, eating what remained with the quiet desperation of those who had learned not to waste anything that might fill an empty belly. Thomas set down his bucket slowly, his heart constricting in his chest. He'd seen plenty of hardship in his 32 years, had lived through his own share of it, but something about the sight of those 2 young ones trying to make a meal of rotten fruit cut him deeper than he'd expected. The woman looked up at the sound of his footsteps, her green eyes wide with fear and shame. She scrambled to her feet, pulling her daughters up with her, ready to run. "Please, mister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't stealing nothing. These here apples were already on the ground, and we thought maybe." Thomas held up a weathered hand. "Easy there, ma'am. Ain't nobody said nothing about stealing." He studied her face in the dying light. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably not much past 25. But hardship had aged her in ways that years alone never could. Her 2 daughters clung to her skirts, their eyes too large in their thin faces, their clothes patched and repatched until there was more mending than original fabric. The older girl had her mother's green eyes and the same stubborn set to her jaw. The younger one was fair-haired like her mother might once have been, with blue eyes that held a kind of quiet acceptance that no child's hold ever have to learn. "Where you folks headed?" Thomas asked gently, keeping his distance so as not to spook them further. The woman's chin lifted slightly. "West," she said. "Cal, if we can make it." Thomas nodded. He'd heard the stories. Gold in California, land for the taking, a chance to start fresh. He'd also heard the other stories. Theonis about families who never made it past the first mountain range, about graves scattered along the wagon trails like bitter seeds. "Got family out there?" he asked. Something flickered in her eyes. Pain maybe, or the echo of a hope that had died somewhere along the way. "Had a husband," she said quietly. "He went on ahead last spring. Said he'd send for us once he got established." She didn't need to say the rest. Thomas could read it in the hollow look in her eyes, in the way she unconsciously pulled her daughters closer. No word had come. No money, no husband. Just 3 people left to make their own way in a world that wasn't particularly kind to women. And children on their own. Autumn wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the yard and making the younger child shiver. Thomas mad at his decision. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat, the one his mother had made him before she'd passed 5 years back, the coat that had seen him through winters when the snow piled higher than the windows, through spring storms that turned the prairie into a muddy sea. "Comin'," he said simply, holding out the coat toward the woman. "No sense standing out here in the cold when there's a warm house just yonder." The woman stepped back as if he'd offer at her a rattlesnake. "Oh, no, sir. We couldn't. We don't want to be a bother. We'll just," "Ma'am," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. "When's the last to meet these little ones had a proper meal?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Thuman's face crumpled slightly before she got control of herself again. "We've been making do," she said, but the words came out weak and unconvincing. "I'm sure you have," Thomas replied. "But making do ain't the same as living, and children need more than rotten apples to grow strong. He took a step closer, moving slow and easy like he would with a spoked horse. Name's Thomas Hartwell. This here's my place, and I'm extending an invitation to supper. Nothing more than that. Just a meal and maybe a warm place to sleep for the night. The woman looked down at her daughters, then back at Thomas. He could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Pride battling with desperation, independence, fighting against the simple need to take care of her children. I'm Sarah McKinnon, she said finally. These are my daughters, Emma and Lucy. The older girl Emma stepped forward slightly. Mama, I'm powerful hungry, she said, her voice small but honest. Sarah's resolve crumbled. We don't have any money to pay you, she said, the words coming out in a rush. But I can work. I can cook and clean and mend. I'm good with animals, too, if you've got livestock that needs tending. Thomas nodded seriously, as if they were negotiating a business deal rather than discussing basic human kindness. Well, now that you mention it, I could use some help around here. Place gets mighty lonely for a man on his own, and there's always more work than daylight to do it in. He held out the coat again. Why don't we start with getting you and the girls warmed up, and we can talk about the rest over supper. This time Sarah took the coat. It was far too big for her, hanging nearly to her knees, but Thomas could see some of the tension leave her shoulders as the warm wool settled around her. Thank you, she said quietly. Kindly of you. Thomas picked up his feed bucket and gestured toward the house. Come on then. House ain't much to look at, but it's solid and warm. As they walked across the yard, little Lucy slipped her hand into Thomas's free one. Her fingers were cold as winter stones, but they curled around his with a trust that made his throat tight. Mr. Thomas, she said, looking up at him with those two serious blue eyes. Do you got any real apples? Ones that ain't gone bad? I surely do, little miss, Thomas replied, giving her small hand a gentle squeeze. Got some put away in the root cellar, sweet as honey and crisp as autumn air. Lucy smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from any of them, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he thought was locked tight. The house sat low and sturdy against the prairie wind, built from logs Thomas had cut and fitted himself when he'd first claimed this land 8 years ago. It wasn't fancy, just 4 rooms and a good stone fireplace, but it was tight and warm with windows that looked out over rolling grass land that stretched to the horizon. Thomas pushed open the front door and ushered them inside. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area with a rough-hewn table and chairs, shelves lined with preserves and supplies, and the big fireplace that would soon chase away the evening chill. Sit yourselves down, Thomas said, setting his bucket by the door. I'll get a fire going and Rust loop some supper. Sarah hesitated in the doorway, still wrapped in his coat. You sure about this? She asked. We're strangers to you. You don't know nothing about us. Thomas struck a match and held it to the kindling he'd laid in the fireplace that morning. I know you're tired and hungry and a long way from home, he said without turning around. I know you love your daughters enough to swallow your pride and ask for help when they need it. Far as I'm concerned, that'll me everything I need to know. The fire caught with a cheerful crackle, and soon warm light was dancing across the walls. Emma and Lucy had settled at the table, their eyes wide as they took in the well-stocked shelves, the clean swept floors, the simple comfort of a home that was truly lived in. Thomas moved around the kitchen with the easy efficiency of a man long used to taking care of himself. He sliced thick pieces of bread from a loaf he'd baked 2 days earlier, carved generous portions from a ham that hung in the pantry, and brought up a jar of his own apple butter from the cellar, along with a small basket of the good apples he'd promised Lucy. Here now, he said, setting the food on the table. This should hold you while I fix something more substantial. Sarah stood up abruptly. I should help, she said. You're already doing too much. Sit, Thomas said firmly but kindly. You look ready Todrup where you stand. Time enough for helping tomorrow if you're still of a mind to stay. He busied himself at feast of putting together a simple but hearty stew from salt pork potatoes and carrots from his own garden. As he worked, he listened to the quiet sounds behind him, the girls eating with the careful restraint of children who'd learned not to waste food, Sarah's murmured reminders about manners, the soft crackling of the fire. Where y'all folks come from originally?" he asked over his shoulder. "Ohio," Sarah replied. "Had a little farm outside Cincinnati. Nothing fancy, but it was ours." "What happened to it?" There was a long pause. Thomas didn't push, just kept stirring the stew and waiting. "Bank took it," Sarah said finally. "Couple bad harvests and we couldn't make the payments. James, my husband, he said we'd be better off starting fresh out west. Anyway, said there was land for the taking and gold just waiting to be picked up off the ground." Thomas had heard variations of this story a dozen times from travelers passing through. The promise of easy riches in California had lured thousands from their homes, breaking up familiar sand, leaving a trail of broken dreams across the continent. "That was more than a year ago," Sarah continued, her voice growing quieter. "We sold everything we had left by a wagon and supplies. James went on ahead with a group of men, said he'd find us a good spot and send word. We stayed behind with my sister until she trailed off, but Thomas could fill in the blanks. Something had happened to the sister. Death maybe, or marriage to a man who didn't want to take on a woman and two children who weren't his own. The reasons didn't matter. What mattered was that Sarah and her daughters had ended up alone with nothing but hope and stubbornness to carry them across 1,000 miles of dangerous country. "You've been walking long?" Thomas asked. Emma answered this time. "Weeks and weeks," she said, around a bite off bread and apple butter. "We had a wagon for a while, but one of the wheels broke and we couldn't fix it proper. Had to leave it behind. Sold the oxen in Junction City," Sarah added. "Got an auto by supplies for the trail, but not enough for another wagon." Thomas ladled the stew into bowls and set them on feedable. The rich smell filled the room, and he saw Lucy's eyes widen with something approaching awe. "It's been a long time since we had hot stew," Sarah said softly, as if reading his thoughts. They ate in comfortable silence after that. The only sounds, the clicking of spoons against bowls, and the satisfied sighs of people finally getting a proper meal. Thomas found himself watching the girls, noting how Emma kept on a protective hand near her little sister's bowl, how Lucy tried to eat slowly even though he could see she wanted to wolf down every bite. When the meal was finished, Sarah started to rise to clear the dishes, but Thomas waved her back down. "Dishes will keep till morning," he said. "Lucy, there looks like she's about to fall asleep in her chair." Indeed, the younger girl was struggling to keep her eyes open, her head nodding like a flower on a weak stem. Emma wasn't much better, though. She was fighting the exhaustion with typical 8-year-old determination. "There's a spare room off the kitchen," Thomas said. "Nothing fancy, but there's a good bed and warm quilts. You ladies are welcome to it." Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd found them behind the barn, he saw tears in her eyes. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why are you doing this?" Thomas considered the question, looking out the window at the dark prairie beyond. Why was he doing this? Loneliness, maybe, or the memory of his own mother, who'd never turned away a soul in need. Or perhaps it was something simpler, the recognition that some things were just the right thing to do regardless of reason or reward. "My mama used to say that kindness is like seed corn," he said finally. "You can eat it all up when times are hard, or you can plant some and trust that the harvest will come when you need it most." He stood up from the table. "Besides, this old house gets mighty quiet with just me rattling around in it. Nice to have some life under the roof again." Sarah nodded, accepting the explanation, even if she suspected there was more to it. "Come in, girls," she said softly. "Time for sleep." As Thomas banked the fire and prepared to turn in himself, he could hear quiet voices from the spare room. Sarah's gentle murmur as she settled her daughters for the night, Emma's whispered questions, Lucy's sleepy responses, the sounds of a family he realized, something he'd given up hoping for long ago. He stood at his bedroom window for a long time that night, looking out over the moonlit prairie and thinking about seed corn, about the strange ways that life could change in the space of a single evening, about the sound of children's laughter that he might hear again if he was very lucky. Morning came with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Thomas woke to sounds he hadn't heard in his house for years. The rustle of skirts, quiet voices, the soft footsteps of people trying not to wake a sleeping household. He dressed quickly and emerged from his room to find Sarah at his stove efficiently. managing breakfast while Emma set the table, and Lucy played quietly in the corner, with a corn husk doll that looked like it had seen better days. "Morning," Sarah said without turning around. "Hope you don't mind. I found the coffee and thought, don't mind at all," Thomas said, accepting the cup she offered him. The coffee was bitter than his usual brew, richer and somehow more flavorful. "Sleep well?" "Better than we have in weeks," Sarah admitted. "That's a fine bed, and those quilts are the warmest things I've felt since we left Ohio." Thomas nodded, settling at the table. "My mother made at those quilts. She had a hand for such things. She's passed," Sarah escagently. 5 years now. Fever took her one winter when the snow was too deep for the doctor to get through. Sarah placed a plate in front of him. Eggs cooked just the way he liked them. Bacon crisp but not burned. Biscuits that were golden and fluffy. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's hard losing the ones who raised us." They ate breakfast in the kind of comfortable quiet that usually took months to develop between people. Emma helped clear the dishes without being asked, and Lucy shyly showed Thomas her cornhusk doll, which she'd named Margaret after a grandmother she could barely remember. After breakfast, Thomas led them outside to show them around the property. His homestead was modest but well-maintained. A good barn with 4 horses and a handful of cattle. A chicken coop that housed 24 hens. A garden plot that had provided well through the growing season. And fields of wheat that would need harvesting soon. "This is beautiful," Sarah said, standing at the edge of the wheat field with the morning sun turning the grain to gold. "You've built something real here." Thomas felt a flush of pride. "Took time," he said. "When I first claimed this land, there wasn't nothing but grass far as you could see. Had to dig the well by hand, cut every log for the house, break the sod for planting." Emma was chasing a butterfly through the wheat, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Lucy sat in the grass making a chain of prairie flowers, her face peaceful in a way that spoke of a child finally feeling safe. "What made you choose this spot?" Sarah asked. Thomas pointed toward a low rise to the north. "High ground for the house, good water, and that hill breaks the worst of the winter wind. Plus, you can see for miles in every direction. Man likes to know what's coming his way." As if summoned by his words, a dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon. Thomas shaded his eyes with his hand, watching the approaching rider with the automatic caution of someone who lived far from towns and neighbors. "Somebody coming," he said quietly. Sarah tensed beside him, her hand reaching automatically for Emma, who had stopped chasing butterflies and was looking toward the approaching dust, with the weariness of a child who'd learned that strangers could mean trouble. The rider solved itself into a man on a bay horse riding hard and raising dust. As he drew closer, Thomas recognized the weathered features and silver beard of Doc Morrison, who served as both physician and unofficial news carrier for the scattered homesteads in the area. "Thomas," Doc called as he reined in his horse. "Glad I caught you home, Doc," Thomas replied, walking forward to meet him. "What brings you out this way so early?" Doc Morrison's eyes flicked curiously toward Sarah and the girls, but his expression remained grave. "Bringing word from town," he said. "There's trouble brewing. Indians been hitting farms to the south. Burned out the Hendersons 3 days ago." Thomas felt this blood chill. The Hendersons were good people with children not much older than Emma and Lucy. "They get out alive?" he asked. Doc nodded grimly. "Barely lost everything but their lives. Tom Henderson's asking folks to come to town. Ford up until the trouble passes." Thomas considered this. Junction City was 20 meters away. A hard day's ride under the best circumstances. With Sarah and the girls, it would be even more difficult. "How many farms hit?" he asked. "For that we know of. Could be more." Doc's gaze moved again to Sarah and her daughters. "Might be wise to head to town, Thomas. Especially now that you got." He paused diplomatically. "Guests to think about." Sarah stepped forward, her chin lifting in that stubborn way Thomas was beginning to recognize. "We don't want to be a burden," she said, "if staying here puts Mr. Hartwell in danger." "Nobody's going anywhere just yet," Thomas said firmly. He looked at EDC. "How recent were these attacks?" "Yesterday morning was the last one we heard about. Could be the raiding parties moved on, or could be they're just getting started." Doc shifted in his saddle. "I'm heading up to the Kowalski place next, then back to town." If you decide to come in, best do it today. After Doc rode off, Thomas found himself facing 3 pairs of eyes. Sarah's green ones filled with worry and guilt. Emma's wide with the kind of fear that came from hearing adult talk about danger asterisk. And Lucy's blue ones still trusting, but beginning to show confusion. Are the Indians going to hurt us? Lucy asked in a small voice. Thomas knelt down to her level. Not if I can help it, little miss, he said gently. But we need to be smart about things for a while. He stood up, his mind already working through the possibilities. His house was sturdy and defensible with good lines of sight in all directions. He had weapons and ammunition, knew the country like the back of his hand. But he also had 3 people to protect now, including 2 children who'd never dealt with this kind of danger. We could go to town, Sarah said quietly. You shouldn't have to, Sarah, Thomas interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. We already been through this. You're my guests, which makes your safety my responsibility. Now I need to think about what's best for all of us. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over his fields, his livestock, everything he'd built with his own hands over the past 8 years. The thought of abandoning it all to hide in town sat poorly with him. But the thought of something happening to Sarah or her daughter sat even worse. What do you think we should do? Sarah asked, coming to stand beside him. Thomas wasqued for a long moment, weighing options. Truth is, I've dealt with Indian troubles before, he said finally. Most times they're looking for easy targets, places where they can get what they need without a fight. This place, he gestured toward the house, the barn, the carefully chosen defensive oppositions. This place ain't easy, but if we went to town, town's 20 meters of open country, Thomas said. If there's raiding parties out there, we'd be sitting ducks on that road, especially with the girls. Emma had been listening from the steps, and now she spoke up. "You ain't afraid," she said, though her voice shook slightly. "Mama taught me to be brave." Thomas smiled at her, this fierce little girl who'd already survived more hardship than most adults. "I can see that," he said. "But being brave didn't mean looking for trouble. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to be careful." He made his decision. "We'll stay," he said, "but we'll be ready." The rest of the morning was spent in preparation. Thomas checked his weapons, 2 rifles, a shotgun, and his father's old Colt revolver, making sure they were clean and loaded. He brought extra ammunition into the house and showed Sarah how to load and fire the shotgun just in case. "Ever handled a gun before?" he asked as she hefted the weapon awkwardly. "Some," she said. "James taught me to shoot rabbits for Thuppet, but nothing like this." Thomas guided her hands to the proper position, showed her how to brace for the recoil. "Shotgun's forgiving," he said. "Don't have to be a marksman. Just point in the general direction and pull the trigger." While they worked, Emma proved herself unexpectedly useful, helping to carry supplies and keeping Lucy occupied with games and stories. The 8-year-old had kind of practical competence that came from a childhood spent helping adults survive, and Thomas found himself impressed by her steady nerves. "You ever been in Indian trouble before?" Emma asked as they carried buckets of water into the house. "Once," Thomas said. "Few years back. Mostly they just wanted to trade, but there was some young bucks looking to prove themselves. Nothing came of it, but it taught me to be prepared. Were you scared?" Thomas considered lying, telling her that grown men didn't get scared. But something in her serious green eyes made him choose honesty instead. "Scared enough," he said. "Fear ain't a bad thing, Emma. Keeps you sharp, makes you think. It's only bad when it stops you from doing what needs doing." That afternoon, they saw more dust on the horizon. Another rider, but this one coming from the north. Thomas kept his rifle close as the horseman approached, but relaxed when he recognized Jake Peterson, a neighbor from 5 miles up the creek. "Thomas," Jake called as he rode into the yard. "You heard about the trouble? Doc Morrison came by this morning," Thomas replied. "Heard about the Hendersons?" Jake nodded grimly. "Burned them out complete. Tom and Mary made it o' town with the clothes on their backs and nothing more." His eyes moved to Sarah and the girls. "Didn't know you had company." "Sarah McKinnon and her daughters," Thomas said simply. "They're staying on for a while." Jake touched his hat politely to Sarah. "Ma'am, hope you picked a good time to visit, though I'm afraid it ain't the safest, just now." "We'll manage," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. "What's the talk in town?" Thomas asked. "Mixed," Jake replied. "Some folks saying it's just a small raiding party that'll move on. Others think it might be the start of something bigger. Army's supposed to be sending a patrol out, but you know how that goes." Thomas nodded. Army patrols had a way of showing up after the trouble was over. If they showed up at all. "You heading to town?" Jake asked. "Thinking we'll stay put," Thomas replied. "Place is defensible and we got what we need." Jake considered this, then nodded approvingly. "Might be the smart play. Road to town's awful exposed, and your place here is built for trouble." He gathered his reins. "I'm heading back to me own spread, but I'll swing by tomorrow if I can make sure you folks are all right." After Jake rode off, the afternoon settled into an uneasy quiet. Thomas worked around the property, checking fences and bringing the livestock closer to the house. Sarah kept busy in the kitchen, preparing a larger than usual supper and making sure they had food that would keep without cooking. Just in case, the girls seemed to sense the tension, playing more quietly than usual and staying close to the house. Lucy had abandoned her flower chains in favor of helping her mother, while Emma appointed herself as lookout, frequently checking the horizon for any sign of dust or movement. As evening approached, Thomas made his final preparations. He secured the barn, making sure the horses were where he could get to them quickly if needed. He checked the well in the root cellar, confirming they had access to water and supplies even if they couldn't leave the house for days. "You think they'll come here?" Sarah asked as they watched the sun sink toward the western horizon. "Hard to say," Thomas replied honestly. "Might not. Might be. They've already moved on to easier pickings, but if they do come," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "We'll be ready." Supper that night was a subdued affair. The food was excellent. Sarah had proven herself to be a cook of considerable skill, but the adults ate with half-tear attention on the windows, listening for sounds that didn't belong. After the dishes were cleared, Thomas bunked the fire lower than usual and made sure the curtains were drawn tight. No sense advertising their presence any more than necessary. "Girls should sleep in our room tonight," Sarah said quietly. "All of us together." Thomas nodded. "Good thinking. I'll take the front room. Keep watch." "You need to sleep too," Sarah protested. "I'll catch what rest I can. Done it before." As the household settled for the night, Thomas positioned himself in a chair by the front window where he could see the approach to the house. His rifle lay across his knees, loaded and ready. The night was clear and cold with enough moonlight to see movement across the prairie. The hours passed slowly. Midnight came and went, marked only by the distant call of an owl and the occasional restless movement of the horses in the barn. Thomas dozed fitfully, trained by years of frontier life to wake at the slightest unusual sound. It was near dawn when he heard it, the soft whinny of a horse that wasn't his own, quickly muffled. Thomas was fully awake instantly, his hand tightening on his rifle as he peered through the curtain. At first, he saw nothing. Then, movement caught his eye, shadows that moved wrong, shapes that didn't belong to the familiar landscape of his homestead. His blood ran cold. Ash counted them. 6, maybe 7 figures moving carefully through the pre-dawn darkness, approaching the house from different directions. Thomas moved quickly, but quietly to the bedroom door. "Sarah," he whispered urgently. "Wake up, we got company." Sarah was alert immediately, the kind of instant wakefulness that came from months of sleeping rough on dangerous trails. "How many?" she whispered back. "Half dozen, maybe more. Get the girls to the root cellar. You remember how to get there?" Sarah nodded. The root cellar was accessed through a trap door in the kitchen floor, hidden beneath a braided rug. Thomas had shown it to her the day before as part of their preparations. "What about you?" she asked, already moving to wake Emma and Lucy. "I'll hold them off long as I can, then come down after you. Go quiet now." Sarah roused the girls with gentle shakes, whispering rigid instructions. To their credit, both Emma and Lucy came awake quickly and without noise, their experiences on the trail having taught them to wake ready for trouble. Thomas watched from the window as the shadowy figures drew closer. In the growing light, he could make out more details. Painted faces, feathers, the gleam of weapons. These weren't traders or peaceful travelers. These were warriors, and they'd come for blood. He heard the soft creak of the trap door closing behind Sarah and the girls, and felt a moment of relief. The root cellar was well hidden and stocked with supplies. Even if the worst happened, they'd have a chance. The first arrow thudded into the wooden shutter beside the window, and Thomas knew the waiting was over. He pushed the barrel of his rifle through a gap in the shutters and took careful aim at the nearest figure. The shot cracked across the morning air, and the warriors spun and fell. Immediately, the others scattered for cover, but not before Thomas got a clear count. 7 warriors, well-armed and clearly experienced. "I see you in there, white man," a voice called from behind Thebern. The English was heavily accented but clear. "Come out now and maybe we let the women live." Thomas didn't bother to answer. Instead, he moved to another window and waited. They'd try to rush the house soon, he knew. The question was whether they'd try to burn him out first or come straight at him. His answer came in the form of a flaming arrow that arced through the air and struck the roof. Thomas cursed under his breath. Fire was his biggest fear. The house was solid, but dry wood would burn. And if they got the roof going, another flaming arrow, this one hitting the sidewall. Thomas could smell smoke beginning to build. He had to act quickly. Moving to the back window, he spotted a warrior crouched behind his wood pile, preparing another fire arrow. Thomas took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped, his arrow falling harmlessly to the ground, but the distraction cost him. As he reloaded, he heard the front door splinter under the impact of something heavy, probably a tomahawk. The door held, but it wouldn't for long. Thomas grabbed his shotgun and positioned himself facing the door. When it finally gave way, he'd be ready. Theodore burst inward, and 2 warriors rushed through. Thomas fired both barrels of the shotgun, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. Both attackers went down, but Thomas could hear more coming. He dropped the shotgun and grabbed his rifle, working the lever action as fast as he could. Another warrior appeared in the doorway, and Thomas put a bullet in his chest. Then another and another, but there were too many, and they kept coming. Thomas felt something burn across his shoulder, an arrow or a knife. Heckled and tell which. He was bleeding, and his ammunition was running low. Time to go. Thomas grabbed his remaining rifle and the bag of ammunition, then headed for the kitchen and the trap door. Behind him, he could hear warriors spreading through the house, searching, destroying. He found the hidden trap door and dropped through it into the darkness below. The root cellar was cool and earthy smelling, lined with shelves holding preserves and root vegetables. In the far corner, he could make out the shapes of Sarah and her daughters, huddled together. "But safe, you hurt?" Sarah whispered as he settled beside them. "Just a scratch," Thomas lied. His shoulder was on fire, and he could feel blood soaking his shirt. But there was no point worrying them. Above them, they could hear boots on the kitchen floor, voices speaking in a language Thomas didn't understand. Someone was methodically searching the house, looking for signs of other occupants. Lucy pressed close to Thomas's good side, her small hand finding his. "Arethy going to find us?" she whispered, so quietly he could barely hear her. "Not if we're real quiet," Thomas whispered back. The sounds above continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, they heard voices moving away from the house. Thomas waited, counting his heartbeats before he eased toward the trap door and listened. Smoke. He could smell smoke stronger now. They'd fired the house. "We got to go," he whispered to Sarah. "They've set the place burning." Sarah's face went white in the dim light filtering down from above. "The house can be rebuilt," Thomas said grimly. "Let's worry about staying alive first." He eased the trap door open a crack and peered up into the kitchen. Smoke was beginning to fill the room, but he couldn't see any warriors. The main fire seemed to be coming from the front of the house. They'd probably torched the front room and were waiting to see who came running out. "There's a door at the back of the cellar," Thomas whispered. "Leads to a tunnel I dug out of the barn. We can get to the horses that way." It was a precaution he'd hoped never to use. A escape route dug during his first winter on the claim, when Comanche raids were more common. The tunnel was narrow and uncomfortable, but it would get them out unseen. Thomas led the way, crawling through the low passage with his rifle clutched awkwardly in his good arm. Behind him, He could hear Sarah helping the girls navigate the narrow space, whispering encouragement when Lucy whimpered at the darkness. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, though Thomas knew it was only about 50 yards from the house to the barn. His wounded shoulders screamed with every movement, and he could feel fresh blood seeping through his shirt. But they had to keep moving. Finally, his hands found the wooden ladder he'd built into the tunnel's end. Above, a trap door opened into the back corner off the barn, hidden behind a pile of hay bales that he'd arranged for just this purpose. Thomas listened carefully before pushing the door open. The barn was quiet except for the nervous shifting of his horses. Spooked by thief smoke and gunfire, he helped Sarah and the girls up into the hay-scented darkness, then closed the trap door behind them. "Stay low," he whispered. "We need to get to the horses and get out of here quick." Through gaps in stubborn walls, Thomas could see his house fully engulfed in flames now. The warriors had done their work thoroughly. Nothing would be left but ashes and memories. But as he watched, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The raiders weren't leaving. They were settling in, making themselves as comfortable around his burning home. Waiting. "They know we got out," Thomas whispered grimly. "They're waiting for us to run." Sarah moved up beside him, peering through the Sama gap. "What do we do?" Thomas considered their options. His horses were good. Butte riding double would slow them down. And with Emma and Lucy to think about, they'd never outrun mounted warriors across open prairie. "We wait," he said finally. "Let them think we died in the fire. Maybe they'll move on." It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only play they had. Thomas led them deeper into the barn to a spot behind the grain bins where they'd be hidden, even if someone came looking the way. Hours that followed were the longest of Thomas's life. They could hear the warriors moving around outside, occasionally calling to each other in their own language. Once someone entered the barn, and Thomas held his breath as footsteps moved through the stalls. But the searcher didn't find their hiding place, and eventually the footsteps retreated. The sun was high overhead when things finally went quiet outside. Thomas waited another hour before he dared to look. The warriors were gone, leaving only the smoldering ruins of his house and the trampled earth where they'd made their camp. "Are they really gone?" Emma whispered. "Think so," Thomas replied, though he kept his rifle ready. "But we ain't taking chances. We'll wait till dark to move." Sarah had been quiet for the past hour, and now Thomas saw why. She was staring at the ruins of his home, her face stricken with guilt and sorrow. "This is our fault," she said quietly. "If we hadn't been here." "Stop," Thomas said firmly. "This ain't on you. Raiders been hitting farms all over the territory. If it wasn't today, it would have been tomorrow or next week. At least this way, nobody died." But even as he said it, Thomas felt the weight of loss settling on his shoulders. 8 years off work gone in a few hours. Everything he'd built, everything that had made this place home, reduced to ashes and charred timber. Lucy tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Thomas," she said in her small voice, "I'm sorry they burned your house." Thomas looked down at her serious little face and felt something shift inside him. The house was gone, yes, but sitting here in the hay with these 3 people who'd somehow become precious to him, he realized that home might be something different than he'd always thought. "It's all right, little miss," he said gently. "Houses can bear a built. What matters is that we're all safe." As darkness finally settled over the prairie, Thomas made his preparations to leave. He saddled his 2 strongest horses and gathered what supplies he could find: blankets, food for the trail, ammunition, and a canvas bag of coins he'd hidden in the grain bin for emergencies. "Where will we go?" Sarah asked as she helped Emma up on 2 of the horses. Thomas swung Lucy up in front of her sister, then helped Sarah mount the second horse before climbing up behind her. The feel of her warm body against his chest made him acutely aware of how much his world had changed in just 2 days. "Jake Peterson's place," he said. 5 miles north. If their raiders hit there too, we'll know. If not, we can ford up there till the trouble passes." They rode through the night, Thomas leading them by paths he knew from years of hunting and exploring. The going was slow. He couldn't risk pushing the horses too hard with them carrying double, and he had to stop frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit. But the prairie remained quiet except for the normal night sounds of wind through grass and the distant call of coyotes. By dawn, They were within sight of Thiepterson Homestead. Asterisk and Thomas felt a surge of relief when he saw smoke rising peacefully from Jake's chimney. Jake met them at his door with a rifle in his hands, but his weathered face broke into a grin of relief when he recognized them. "Thomas, thank God you made it. We saw the smoke yesterday and feared the worst. Raiders hit us at dawn," Thomas said warily as he helped Sarah and the girls down from the horses. "Burned the house, but we got out through the root cellar." Jake's wife, Martha, appeared in the doorway, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and capable hands. She took one look at the exhausted group and immediately began organizing. "Get them inside. Jake, Sarah, honey, you and the girls come with me. Thomas, you're bleeding all over my porch. Let me have a look at that shoulder." The next few hours passed in a blur of hot food, medical attention, and the simple comfort of being safe among friends. Martha cleaned and bandaged Thomas's wound, a deep gash from an arrow that had barely missed anything vital, while Jake filled them in on what had happened to other farms in the area. "Henderson's made it to town safe," Jake reported, "but Kowalski's weren't so lucky. Got plenty of room, and Jake could use the help with harvest coming up." Thomas looked at Sarah, who was sitting at the kitchen table with Lucy on her lap, and Emma pressed close against her side. The strain of the past day had aged her, but there was something else in her fascino, a kind of quiet strength that came from surviving the worst and still being whole. "That's kind of you, Martha," Sarah said, "but we can't impose forever. Thomas lost this home because of us, and now don't start that again," Thomas interrupted gently. "What happened happened. No sense in carrying blame for things that ain't your fault." Over the next few days, as they settled into the rhythm of life at Peterson Place, Thomas found himself thinking more and more about the future. His homestead was gone, but he had no money saved to start over. The question was where and with whom. Jake had been right about needing help with the harvest, and Thomas threw himself into the work with grateful energy. Physical labor helped quiet the restless thoughts that plagued him at night, and it felt good to be useful again. Sarah proved herself invaluable around the Peterson household, helping Martha with cooking, cleaning, and endless tasks that kept a frontier home running. Emma and Lucy quickly adapted to their new surroundings, and Thomas often found himself watching them play in the yard with the Peterson children, marveling at how resilient children could be. It was during the second week off their stay that Sarah brought up the subject that had been weighing on all their minds. "I've been thinking about California," she said one evening as they sat on the Petersons' front porch watching the sunset over the prairie. "About James and what I should do." Thomas had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it had to come. "You still planning to go looking for him?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. "I don't know," she said finally. "Part of me thinks I should. He's my husband, that girl's father. But another part," she trailed off, but Thomas thought he understood. "The woman who'd left Ohio more than a year ago, trusting and hopeful, was gone. In her place was Simeon, who'd learned to rely on herself, who'd seen the worst that could happen and survived it." "What does your heart tell you?" Thomas asked gently. "My heart tells me that James made his choice when he left us behind," Sarah said, her voice steady but sad. "A man who truly loved his family wouldn't have gone so long without sending word. Wouldn't have left his wife and children to fend for themselves." Thomas nodded. He'd suspected as much, but he'd wanted her to come to the realization herself. "So what will you do?" Sarah looked out over the prairie, her green eyes thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that. Martha says there's work to be had in town. Teaching maybe, or taking in sewing. I could make a life there for me and the girls. Town's a good place for raising children." Thomas agreed, though the thought of Sarah and the girls leaving left him feeling hollow inside. "Schools, churches, other families. What about you?" Sarah asked, turning to look at him directly. "What will you do now?" Thomas had been asking himself the same question. "Got to start over somewhere," he said. "Been thinking about pushing further west, maybe Oregon Territory. Land's still free there for the claiming. Alone." The question hung between them like morning mist, full of officeability and unspoken longing. Thomas looked at Sarah's face in a saw, the fading light, seeing the woman she'd become over these past weeks. Strong, capable, beautiful in a way that went deeper than mere appearance. Depends, Hess quietly. On what? Thomas took a deep breath. This was harder than facing down raiders or starting over from nothing. This was about opening his heart and risking everything on the slim chance of it. She might feel the same way. Whether a certain widow might consider taking a chance on a burned-out farmer was got nothing to offer but a willingness to work hard and a promise to love her and her daughters, like they were his own. Sarah's breath caught, and for a moment Thomas thought he'd misread everything, that he'd just destroyed the friendship they'd built. Then she smiled, the first real full smile he'd seen from her since that day behind his barn, and reached over to take his hand. "Thomas Hartwell," she said softly, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I reckon I am," Thomas replied, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I know it's sudden, and I know you got reasons to be careful about trusting men." But Sarah silenced him by leaning over and kissing him, soft and sweet, and full of promise. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, I'll marry you." From inside the house came the sound of children's laughter. Emma and Lucy playing some game with the Peterson youngsters. Thomas thought about the future. He was suddenly brave enough to imagine a new homestead somewhere green and fertile. A house filled with the sounds of family. Children growing up safe and loved. "We'll go to Oregon," Sarah said as if reading his thoughts. "Start fresh. I'll off us together." Thomas squeezed her hand. "It won't be easy. Oregon's a long way off, and the trail's got its own dangers." "I'm not afraid," Sarah said, and Thomas could see that she meant it. The woman who'd been scraping mold off rotten apples just weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone who'd stared down the worst life could offer and emerged stronger for it. Besides, she had dead with a smile that made his heart skip. "I hear there's good apple trees in Oregon, and I've got a powerful fondness for apples now." Thomas laughed, remembering that first day, the sight of her and her daughters behind his barn. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a month. The wedding was held 2 weeks later in the Petersons' front yard, with Jake officiating, and Martha providing a feast that would be remembered for years to come. Emma served as Sarah's bridesmaid, solemn and proud in a new dress that Martha had sewn for the occasion. Lucy scattered wild flower petals with the serious concentration of a child given an important job, as Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, his mother's ring, saved from the fire because he'd been carrying it in his pocket since the day he'd decided to propose. He thought about the strange ways that life could change, how disaster could sometimes be the way to joy. "You may kiss your bride," Jake announced with a grin. Thomas did. Toth cheers of the assembled neighbors and the delighted giggles of the children. When they broke apart, Sarah was crying, but her tears were the happy kind. "What now, Mrs. Hartwell?" Thomas asked softly. "Now we go home," Sarah replied. "Our real home, wherever that might be." They left for Oregon the following spring, after a winter spent in Junction City, where Thomas worked at the blacksmith shop and Sarah taught at the small schoolhouse. Emma and Lucy had thrived during the winter months, growing taller and stronger, their faces filling out with regular meals and the security of knowing they were loved and wanted. The journey west was long and difficult, but they faced it together, Thomas and Sarah riding side by side, Emma and Lucy in the wagon bed with their few possessions and the dreams they carried of the life they'd build at Trail's End. They found their new home in the Willamette Valley, a stretch offered of land beside a clear running creek with timber for building, and soil rich enough to grow anything they planted. Thomas built their house slowly and carefully using lessons learned from his first homestead. This time he built it to last, built it to hold a family. Sarah planted her garden that first spring, and when the apple tree they'd brought as a sapling from Kansas finally bore fruit 5 years later, they were the sweetest apples anyone in the valley had ever tasted. Emma grew up to be a teacher like her stepfather had always known she would, while Lucy became a renowned seamstress whose quilts were treasured throughout the territory. Both married well and stayed close to home, raising their own children, within sight of the house where they'd learned that families weren't just made by blood, but by love and choice and the willingness to stand together when times got hard. And sometimes on autumn evenings, when the light slanted golden across the prairie grass that still grew wild beyond their fields, Thomas and Sarah would sit on their porch and remember that day behind the barn, when 3 hungry people had been eating rotten apples, and a lonely man had taken off his coat and said, "Come in." It had been the beginning of everything that mattered, the beginning of home. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.